Last week we started a series called Everyday Hero. And for us, what this really means is that God's called us to be an everyday hero. Last week we talked about how everyday heroes are influencers like our moms, but not necessarily just limited to moms or even limited to parents. God calls every one of us to be influential. And one of the things that we're doing during this series is we're trying to identify and highlight some different folks around Journey who are living out this everyday hero kind of thing in their life. And the reality is that what we try to do is find these people who are living what we call a surrendered life, a life that is more surrendered, right? That is more fully surrendered to Jesus. And one of the people that I ran across was Carol Hood. Carol Hood is a sweet lady, is a part of Journey Church, and she volunteers time cooking meals for a group called Orchard House in Milan. Orchard House is kind of a halfway house between some level of incarceration or addiction and regular back home kind of life. And living in that space, dealing with recovery from addiction, dealing with kind of learning job skills, doing all those things is difficult for a lot of folks. And there's about 100 men that they're capable of housing over at Orchard House in Milan. And what a fantastic, fantastic thing. Carol started cooking meals for them, just thought she was just gonna cook a meal and help out, right? Just do a little bit to do something, right? And what she realized is that she said that it was far more rewarding than she ever thought it could be. This is what Carol had to say. She said, I had no idea how rewarding it would be. I thought I was just gonna cook meals. I've become like a mama to the men. Some of them someone for them to talk to when they feel like nobody else is listening. That's a pretty amazing thing. And if you ask me, she is an everyday hero. And that matters to us, to our church, because that's the kind of people that God's called every one of us to be. But the problem is that most of the time when we think about the idea of being a hero, we tend to think about somebody who can leap tall buildings in a single bound, or somebody who goes to a special school because they've got some sort of mutated ability. That's a X-Men reference if you don't recognize it offhand. But the truth is that God calls every last one of us to be everyday heroes. That God has a plan for you and I to be a hero in the everyday of our lives. Now, I don't know about you, but like when I think of everyday heroes, I don't tend to think about superheroes. I tend to think that a hero probably is somebody who rushes in when everybody else is rushing out. When I think of the word hero, I have a tendency to think of somebody like teachers who stand in a classroom and help educate our children. I think of people like nurses and doctors and first responders who care about people when they're in a crisis situation. I think about crisis counselors who rush in to help the emotionally troubled when something terrible happens in someone's life. Trauma is so difficult. Like all these kinds of people who rush in, our military, when everybody else is rushing out, provide safety for other people. That's what I think of when I think of a hero. It's not a superhero, it's a real hero. Everyday heroes are what God called us to be. The kinds of people who rush in when everybody else is rushing away. The kinds of people who welcome and love and care for people when everybody else is ostracizing them, when everybody else is pushing them away. And that's the kinds of people that we're not only called to be, it's the kind of person Jesus was. And the crazy thing about Jesus is that he always called unusual suspects, right? Like he called the people who are unusual suspects. That's us right here. That's us. That's these people. That's us right here looking at each other, right? We're unusual suspects. In fact, turn to the person next to you. You pick which one, it doesn't matter. And you tell them, you're unusual. Right. Now turn to the other person and tell them, you're suspect. The truth is that there are some things in our lives where we just go, man, I don't realize that God's calling me to that. But you and I are unusual suspects. Unusual suspects is who God calls to be everyday heroes. He calls unusual suspects like you and me to be everyday heroes in our life. All throughout Scripture, he's been doing it. Like he called Moses to lead his children out of the children of Israel out of Egypt. Moses was a murderer. And he called Rahab to help Rahab help free the spies and find them a way out so that God could utilize. She was a key participant. And you're going to hear her story in a couple of weeks. But Rahab was a prostitute. And God called and used David to be, and God said he was a man after his own heart, and he chose David to lead the people of Israel. But David was a power-grabbing, power-abusing adulterer, guilty of murder. God used fishermen. Jesus called fishermen and said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. People that were nobodies to be his disciples. Murderers, adulterers, nobodies. These are the unusual suspects that God called to be everyday heroes. And that's exactly where we're going to land today, is on a story that you might have heard before. Now, lots of these kind of like Bible stories, right, you might have heard, but maybe this one you've heard a little more than others. It's a fairly well-known story. Maybe you heard it in VBS growing up, if you were around church in the summer times as a kid, maybe a backyard Bible club. Maybe you heard the story of Zacchaeus when you were in Sunday school as a kid. Or maybe you've never heard the name Zacchaeus. Maybe when you hear Zacchaeus, you think, bless you, right? But that's not what it's not about. That's a weird name, but it's not a sneeze. Zacchaeus is an interesting story. Now, I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page. I want to make sure we're not all existing in different places, maybe having a Sunday school understanding or a VBS story remembrance, or maybe you're confusing with another story, or maybe you don't know anything about it. So I did a little bit of research, and this man who is kind of a well-known commentator, Victor B. Stromboli. Victor B. Stromboli said this about Zacchaeus. Very interesting thing. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. And he climbed up in a sycamore tree because the Lord he wanted to see. And when the Savior came that way, he looked up in the tree and he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. Now, it sounds like you know a little bit more about Zacchaeus than you thought, right? Children's song, I think you can thank me later for not singing it to you. But that children's song tells us the story of Zacchaeus, gives us the framework. I mean, Zacchaeus was a little guy, climbs up in a tree, wants to see Jesus. And Jesus comes by and says, you come down and I'm coming to your house today. And all of that story plays out. And we know maybe the details of the story. We might know the narrative of the story. But I think every one of us have missed some things, maybe just behind the cover, right? Maybe just below the surface. Maybe something that was really intended for us to get out of this story that's in a deeper understanding, a better understanding I think every one of us have. Let's kick into the story. It starts off like this. Jesus entered Jericho. Jericho was a very affluent city. It's where everybody came to bring all their money, all their change, all their trade, all their stuff that they were doing. And they showed up at Jericho to do that sort of thing. So this is the place, this is the hub. This is the New York City. This is the LA. This is the Hollywood, right? This is the place where dreams come alive and all the stuff is happening. So all the influential, rich people are all in Jericho. And he was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, bless you. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Now, I know you know this, that tax collectors are not well-liked people, but maybe you don't quite understand what's going on with Zacchaeus' story. Because not only were tax collectors not liked, because tax collectors weren't liked. The Romans, who were in charge of Jericho, right? The Romans didn't love Jews at all. They didn't like them at all. They thought they were terrible. They didn't like them. They just thought they were servants, that kind of garbagey people in their culture. So Romans didn't like tax collectors because they were Jews. And Jews didn't like tax collectors because tax collectors worked for the Roman government that hated them. The Roman government was oppressing them, and tax collectors literally came around and said, you owe money to Rome. But it was worse than just being the person who was stuck with the job. They were authorized by Rome to go out into the community and say, you owe this much in taxes. And they were authorized by Rome to get a little extra for themselves while they were there. It's their commission. They said, look, here's how much you got to raise. Here's how much you got to pay us in taxes. And you can get as much more as you're not. And you've got the force of the Roman government to do it. So they were hated by the Jews, like hated, because not only were they tax collectors representing an oppressive regime, but they were also thieves. And then Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector. He was a tax collector that wasn't just better than all the other ones, he was over all the other ones. So he's the one who empowered and relayed and worked out to network all the underling tax collectors. So he was the worst of the worst of the worst. Tax collector, thief, and a chief, one of both of them at that. It's a big deal in the story, but I want us to get something that's so important here, is that we can't miss this is what God's doing, because that's a mess. And I want you to understand something, that Zacchaeus' story turns around because there is no amount of mess that God can't turn into a ministry, and you need to hear that. You need to hear that there's no amount of your mess or my mess that God can't turn into a ministry. There's no choice that you've made, no part of your life, no thing that you know, no secret in the back of your mind that God can't use to turn into a ministry. And it's a powerful story what he does with Zacchaeus. But you need to understand there's no amount of mess in your life or in mine that can't be turned into a ministry. And Luke starts out with this story, and he kind of paints this picture of who Zacchaeus is, because he wants us to understand this. This is the MO, the modus operandi of Jesus. He does this. He steps into messy stories. He starts out with coming to Jericho, this affluent city, and steps right into a story about a chief tax collector. Story goes on, verse 3. Says he wanted to see who Jesus was. This is Zacchaeus. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Now let's just kind of wrap our minds around this. He wanted to see who Jesus was because Jesus was coming to Jericho, and when Jesus came to Jericho, there were all kinds of rumors about who Jesus was. Some people were saying that he was a blasphemer. Some people were saying that Jesus was a miracle worker. Some people were saying he was a prophet. Some people were saying that he was the Messiah. And some people were saying he was just crazy, just homeless, right? And there's all these people, all these opinions, and that culture then, it's not that much difficult than this culture now. Because when we hear, and there's a lot of opinions and a lot of buzz, even competing opinions and competing buzz, right? We all still gather a crowd, whether it's a lot just to see the spectacle, if nothing else, just to be a part of the story about what's going on in the culture. And so there was a lot of people coming to that, but there was a problem that Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was. He just wanted to lay eyes on him. He wanted to see it, be a part of it, but he was hated by people, and he was short. And he wasn't just short, he's short. Like he's a little dude. Because anthropologists, studying remains from that era and all that kind of stuff, tell us that the average man was about 5'3" tall. That's a little dude, right? 5'3" tall is an average person. So when you're short and the average person is 5'3", ain't good, right? I mean, like he's Danny DeVito short. Danny DeVito's 4'10", or maybe he's Simone Biles short. She's 4'8". But no matter how you measure it up, this is a really short human person, right? And he's not only short, can't see over everybody else, but he's hated by everybody else. He's a little guy who's hated by people. He feels completely alone. And all he wants to do is make eye contact with Jesus. He just wants to see what the fuss is all about. Because there was a rumor that was bigger than the blasphemers, than the miracle worker. For Zacchaeus, the bigger rumor wasn't that he was a prophet or some sort of spectacle to see. See, there was a rumor that went around that Zacchaeus heard, that he accepted people, even really rejected people. He had heard the rumor that one of Jesus' closest disciples was this guy named Matthew, who was just like Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector. So there's no worry, no wondering why it was that Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus because he had accepted people like him. And there was an important piece that needed to be understood there, and something that you and I need to hear. Maybe if you're not hearing anything else I say, then you just tune in and listen to this, because this is an important part of it, because there are no exceptions to God's acceptance. Let me say that again. There's no amount of mess that God can't turn into a ministry, and there is no exception to God's acceptance. You are accepted. And this is what's crazy about it. Like, this is what's so insane about the story of Zacchaeus that we miss when we just sing the little song or know the little story, is that he was completely rejected. He was completely ostracized and away from everyone else. But he knew that in Jesus he would find acceptance. And Jesus' acceptance of him is what happens in the next verse. Look, it says, so he ran ahead, this is Zacchaeus, ran ahead and climbed up a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now I got to get to it, like, this is super important, because if you want to see Jesus, these are things that we have to understand. What did he do to see Jesus? He did something that embarrassed him. You see, the idea of climbing a fig tree would have been a ridiculous notion. He's a full-grown man. He's not very grown, but he's full-grown. He's not a child. And men in this culture are much more aware of the rejection of society than they are in our culture maybe today. Like, the idea of a man climbing up in a tree and showing his legs, a man doing that in some sort of dignity, especially a very wealthy, prominent person, right? A person like him would never have been allowed to do that and be accepted. So what he did was profound. It was so much more than just getting a better vantage point. You see, Zacchaeus was willing to humble himself to be able to see Jesus. You know, the reality is that we all have some things that keep us from Jesus, don't we? Billy Graham famously said that we had things like idolatry, things in our own things, obstacles to our faith, idolatry, our own pride, our own worldliness, or our secret sins. And truth of it is that worldliness is the one that caught my eye. I have a tendency to try my best to see Jesus through the world, right? Trying to peek around the corners and say, hey, do I see Jesus through all these things? But most of the time, what really is the thing that holds me back is my own pride, isn't it? It's my own thinking of myself pretty strongly, right? Like, I have a tendency to make me big when I feel small. Like Zacchaeus, we all feel small, don't we? We all feel insignificant, insecure. We all feel, unworthy. And what is our tendency to do when we feel insignificant or insecure? I don't know about you, but I don't tend to just admit my insecurity. You know what I tend to do? I tend to compensate for my insecurity. Instead of admitting my insecurity, I tend to compensate for it. When I feel small, what do? We cover up with anger. When we feel insecure or small through something, we tend to puff ourselves up, make ourselves look or feel better in it, instead of just admitting that we're lonely and we need. And what Zacchaeus was willing to do is humble himself. He was willing to lay down his pride and lay down his embarrassment because he wanted to see Jesus. The Jesus that there is no exception to his acceptance. And that is pretty powerful and profound. The other thing I think that was amazing, for me anyways, is that Zacchaeus was willing to look past the crowd. For me, I tend to look through the crowd. Do you see that in your life? Like, you tend to look around you at the culture and kind of measure their responses. Are they going to think I'm okay? Are they going to think I'm a crazy person if I start giving like that? Are they going to think I don't have my priorities straight if I do this? Are these people going to judge me differently? If I choose to say, no, I don't want to invest our family's time in that sport or in that thing, and I choose to say we're gonna make church and valuing God's story in our lives more important than other stories. If I choose to do that, are people going to think that I'm not caring? If I punish my kids this way or deal with them that way, are they going to think that I'm different than the world? Well, Zacchaeus was like, look, I don't care what the world says. In fact, the world was the only thing keeping Zacchaeus from seeing Jesus. And so Zacchaeus did the only thing that was reasonable. He took the world out of his viewpoint. Man, we could learn from that, couldn't we? What would happen If everyday heroes like us, people called to be influential, what if we, instead of trying to see God and faith and his will through the world's views around us, through the views of our culture, what if we took the culture out of our view? What if we looked over the culture and we just said, I just want to see Jesus? It's exactly what Zacchaeus did. He climbed up in a tree so that he could see Jesus, and because Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. Now hold on a second. When I heard this as a kid, Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he, climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And when the Savior passed that way, he looked up in the tree, and I always heard it this way, Zacchaeus, you come down. Like you're just telling him, you're not supposed to be up in that tree. You're supposed to be down here with everybody else. That's not what Jesus was saying. Jesus wasn't saying, Zacchaeus, you come down because you're not supposed to be up in that tree. He wasn't saying, Zacchaeus, get down from there. He was saying this, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. You got to get down here because here's the deal. I must stay at your house today. Wow, that's profound. That was not just some like, hey, I'm coming over today, right? He's not going, hey, Zacchaeus, you and I, we should grab lunch one day soon. We should get some coffee and catch up. He wasn't just saying, hey, Zacchaeus, I want to come over to your place. I want to see what you've done with the place, right? He wasn't saying that. Jesus was locking eyes with Zacchaeus and saying, Zacchaeus, you're going to want to come down right now. Because the acceptance that you climbed up there for, you humbled yourself to find acceptance. You elevated your view above the crowd. The acceptance that you were looking for, you found it. And I'm coming to your house today. See, you and I think that like having dinner with somebody is like you just go over to their house and you eat some dinner, somebody does the dishes, and you jump on your phone and make small talk until the night's over. That wasn't what a meal was like to them. A meal was like to them was a sign of intimacy. What Jesus was saying to Zacchaeus wasn't, I'm going to come over and tell you why you're all wrong, why you're all messed up, because you wouldn't eat with people that you didn't accept. What Jesus was offering Zacchaeus was unconditional acceptance. I accept you exactly where you are, Zacchaeus, up in the tree, but you're going to want to come down and be close to me because I love you enough not to leave you there. Let me say that again. Jesus was saying to Zacchaeus, I love you and accept you exactly where you are right now. But I love you enough not to leave you there. You're going to want to come down immediately. And what's profound here is what happens over the rest of this story. Because in verse 7, it says this, is that all the people saw this and began to mutter. He was gone to be the guest of a sinner. You see what was going on? The rest of the crowd was picking up exactly what Jesus was laying down. Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house. I want to be with you. I want to know your story. I want to help you. I want to love you. I want to care for you where you're at. But I love you enough not to leave you where you are. The rest of the crowd muttered that he was a sinner. He's one of those people. I got to be honest with you. I see this response a lot. There have been times over even the course of this, 13 years or so as Journey Church, where people have said to us, well, I don't know if I want to be a part of a church where you can just wear whatever you want to wear. Or I don't know if I want to be a part of a church that accepts people who are really jacked up and broken. I don't know if I want to be a part of a church where people who've been divorced, or people who cheated on their spouses, or people who got arrested, or people who've been through an addiction. I don't know if I want to be a part of a church that accepts those people. And to which I would say, I don't know if I want to lead a church that doesn't. Because that's the kind of place that Jesus was. That Jesus was for Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, you're going to want to come down here a minute because I love you exactly where you are, but I love you enough not to leave you there. And I love the murmur of the crowd because it just reminds me that the murmur of the crowd means that I'm doing exactly what it is that God wants me to do. So let me ask you that question. Are you stepping out and being an everyday hero? Are you being an everyday hero in the places that everybody would say, I can't believe you're doing that? If you're not doing the right job. If you are, it's a surefire sign that God has called you as an unusual suspect to step out of your comfort zone and be just like Jesus, who calls Zacchaeus out and says, you come down because I got news for you, buddy. And what's crazy is what happens between verse 7 and verse 8. It doesn't tell us what happens. We get in the next verse, we kind of get how the story turns and how it all of a sudden changes, but we don't get what happens between. We know that he goes to his house, right? We figure out that there must have been a dinner, right? We don't know what was said at the dinner, what Jesus said to get a response or an action out of Zacchaeus, but all we know is there was a dinner. I can only fill in the blanks with my imagination. I imagine that Jesus had dinner with him. Imagine that he invited Matthew, one of his disciples. I imagine that Jesus and Matthew sat down with Zacchaeus. And just in my mind, I can imagine that he was saying to Zacchaeus, Matthew's like, dude, I was in exactly the same place you were. I was alone. I was broken. I felt rejected. I felt distance from everybody. I felt completely lonely until Jesus came into my town. And he looked at me and he said, follow me, And I dropped everything to follow him. And Zacchaeus is the best decision I've ever made, because I found acceptance when all I had was rejection. I found peace when all I had was turmoil and hatred. And I want you to know something. What I found is worth having, because that's what's crazy, is that Zacchaeus didn't find Jesus. Matthew didn't find Jesus. Jesus found Zacchaeus. Jesus found Matthew. What's crazy about it is, remember when he was back up in the tree? He climbed up in the tree, and when Jesus reached the spot, he said to him, Zacchaeus, he knew his name. You come down to me, because I'm going to your house today, right? He knew his name. Zacchaeus thought he was positioning himself to see Jesus, but Jesus was already looking for Zacchaeus. Matthew thought he saw Jesus in town, but Jesus was looking for Matthew. He said, you, Matthew, come on, follow me. What's profound and what changes here is this unbelievable moment when Jesus finds them. I remember seeing a bumper sticker a few years back, and I saw it. It said, I found Jesus. And I wonder if he was playing hide and seek, or what was he doing? Why does this bumper sticker need to say, I found Jesus? Then not long after that, somebody at church here, I mentioned it in a service, and somebody at church here got me a bumper sticker that said, I found Jesus. He was in my trunk the whole time. And my wife won't let me put it on my car. But it's so funny, because we think so much of ourselves. We think that we found Jesus. Maybe you think that today. Maybe you think you're here, and what's keeping you from Jesus is your questions or your answers. But I want you to know something. As hard as you might be looking for Jesus, he's looking so much harder for you. As much as you might have invested in following Jesus, he's invested far more in finding you. You might have your questions or your tensions or issues, but he gave his life to find you. And when you find acceptance like that, when you find that there is no exception to acceptance that comes from Jesus, you do some radical things when you give your life to Jesus. What happens next in the story is Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount. You see, the normal standard is if you cheated somebody out of $100, you had to pay them back $120. You had to give them 20% basically as kind of like your penance for it. But he said, I'll pay back 4 times the amount. I'm going to go over the top. I'm going to give away half of what I have, and I'm going to pay back everything 4 times over. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. This is the clincher. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. For the Son of Man, the God of the universe, the Savior of the world, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, came to earth to seek and to save the lost. You and I are called to be everyday heroes. You and I are called to be representatives of the Good Shepherd, the one who left the 99 to go find the one who says, no matter what, I will love and accept people exactly where they are. I will love and accept them there, but I will love them enough not to leave them there. We love you because we were first loved by Jesus. We are representatives. We're people who love and accept you exactly where you are, and we love you enough not to leave you there. So let me just remind you, if you're a follower of Jesus, God has called you to be an influential, everyday hero who lives out this message by joining him in the mission, seeking and saving the lost. But if you're here today and you're not sure about following Jesus yet, and you've got arm's length for this whole thing, you're not sure about it yet, I want you to know that we create a journey so that you have a safe place to push back and ask questions. But I want you to know, as much as you're willing to ask questions, he's willing to do much more. Because as hard as you're looking for him, he's been looking for you for much longer and willing to give much more than you are.